A grandma feeds a disabled and low IQ boy, unaware. He was the son of... Enjoy the story. The soup ladle trembled in Eleanor's weathered hand as she stirred the large pot of lentil stew. Steam rose in gentle whirls, carrying the aroma of bay leaves and caramelized onions throughout the cramped community kitchen. Outside, Chicago's November winds howled against the windows, rattling the metal frames. Eleanor's arthritis flared with each gust, but she continued her work, the pain a familiar companion after 73 years of life. Her faded blue apron, spotted with years of splatters from countless meals served, hung loosely on her shrinking frame. A strand of silver hair escaped from her bun, and she tucked it back with a practiced motion, surveying the line of hungry souls awaiting their turn. The soup kitchen had been Eleanor's sanctuary since Robert passed 3 years ago. The empty apartment held too many ghosts, too many echoes of a life once shared. Here, among the steel counters and mismatched bowls, she found purpose. The grateful nods from weathered faces were worth more than any paycheck she'd ever received. Eleanor ladled soup into a chipped ceramic bowl, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she handed it to a young mother clutching a toddler to her chest. That's when she spotted him, a small figure huddled in the corner, separate from everyone else. The boy couldn't have been more than 6, though his vacant expression made him appear somehow both younger and older simultaneously. His clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, clean but worn. What struck Eleanor most was his stillness amid the bustling room, like a painting among moving pictures. He clutched a tattered stuffed rabbit to his chest, its once white fur now a dingy grey, one ear half missing. His eyes, large and dark, stared at nothing in particular. "Martha, take over for me a minute, will you?" Eleanor asked her fellow volunteer, already untying her apron. She filled a fresh bowl with soup, added an extra piece of cornbread, and made her way toward the boy. As she approached, she noticed how he rocked slightly, almost imperceptibly, his fingers continuously stroking the rabbit's remaining ear. "Hello there, young man," Eleanor said softly, kneeling despite her protesting knees. "Are you hungry?" The boy didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. Eleanor had seen this before. Her youngest grandson, Timothy, had similar mannerisms before his diagnosis. She recognized the signs of a different kind of mind, one that experienced the world in ways others couldn't understand. "My name's Eleanor, but most folks call me Ellie," she continued, placing the bowl nearby but not too close. "And what shall I call you?" When he remained silent, she simply nodded. "That's all right. You don't need to speak to enjoy some soup. It's my mother's recipe, you know. She used to say good food warms twice, once in the belly and once in the heart." Eleanor settled beside him, giving him space. She hummed softly, an old lullaby she'd sung to her children decades ago. After several minutes, the boy's rocking slowed. His eyes flickered toward the steam rising from the bowl. Slowly, like a wild animal approaching an offering, his free hand reached for the spoon. Eleanor held her breath as he dipped it into the broth, brought it to his lips, and took his first tentative taste. The kitchen door swung open with such force that it slammed against the wall. A tall man in an expensive charcoal overcoat rushed in, his polished leather shoes incongruous against the worn linoleum floor. His face was lined with exhaustion, panic evident in every tense muscle. "Tommy!" he called out, his voice breaking. "Tommy, where are you?" The boy's hand froze midway to his mouth, the spoon clattering back into the bowl. The man's eyes locked onto the small figure in the corner, and he practically collapsed with relief, rushing forward. "Tommy, thank God," he breathed, falling to his knees before the child. "I've been looking everywhere for you." He reached for the boy, but Tommy shrank back, clutching his rabbit tighter, his face contorting in distress. Eleanor instinctively moved between them. "Easy now," she advised. "He's just started to feel comfortable." The man stared at her, then at the half-empty soup bowl. He's eating. Disbelief colored his voice. He actually took food from you? Eleanor nodded. Just a few spoonfuls, but yes. That's... The man ran a hand through his immaculately styled hair, disheveling it. He hasn't willingly eaten for anyone but his mother in over a year. And she's... His voice caught. She's not with us anymore. Understanding dawned on Eleanor as she studied the man more closely. His tailored suit couldn't hide the shadows beneath his eyes, the grief etched into the corners of his mouth. "I'm Frank Edwards," he said, extending a trembling hand. "Tommy's father." "Eleanor Miller," she replied, taking his hand. "Though most folks just call me Ellie." Frank looked at his son, who had returned to rocking, his expression once again distant. "He has severe autism and an intellectual disability," he explained quietly. "He wandered off when our new nanny wasn't watching carefully enough. I've been searching for hours." His voice broke on the last word, revealing the terror he must have felt. Eleanor nodded. "My grandson Timothy is on the spectrum too. Not as severely, but I recognize the signs." She turned back to Tommy and began humming again, picking up the spoon. After a moment, Tommy's hand reached out, covering hers, guiding the spoon back to the soup. Frank watched in astonishment. "How are you doing that?" he whispered, careful not to break the spell. Eleanor smiled gently. "I'm not doing anything special," she replied. "Just giving him time and respect. Children like Tommy, they have their own pace, their own way of seeing the world. Sometimes all they need is someone patient enough to walk alongside them instead of trying to pull them forward." As Tommy continued eating, Frank observed Eleanor's gentle interactions with his son, the tenderness in her weathered hands, the quiet understanding in her eyes. When the bowl was empty, Tommy actually looked up at Eleanor, the briefest glimmer of connection flashing across his features. "Mrs. Miller," Frank said suddenly, "I'd like to hire you to help with Tommy." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "I'm just a volunteer here, Mr. Edwards. I don't have any professional qualifications." "You have something better," Frank insisted, watching as Tommy leaned slightly against Eleanor's arm, a gesture so small yet so monumental. "You have whatever it is that my son responds to. Please, at least consider it. I can pay whatever you think is fair." Eleanor studied the desperate father before her, sensing the weight of grief and responsibility on his shoulders. She thought of her empty apartment, the silence that greeted her each night. She looked at Tommy, still clutching his rabbit, vulnerable in a world that wasn't designed for minds like his. "I don't need much money, Mr. Edwards," she finally said. "But I think perhaps your son and I could help each other." Neither realized in that moment how profoundly their lives had just changed, how a chance encounter in a humble soup kitchen would ripple outward, touching more lives than they could imagine. Eleanor simply saw a child who needed warmth. Frank saw a lifeline he never expected, and Tommy, in his own way, had found the beginning of a bridge back to the world that had become so frightening after his mother's death. Winter descended upon Chicago with bitter vengeance, transforming the city into a landscape of steel and ice. Eleanor's journey to the Edwards brownstone in Lincoln Park became a daily ritual, her boots crunching through snow, breath hanging in the air like fleeting ghosts. The transition hadn't been easy. Tommy's meltdowns during her first week had left them both exhausted, his screams echoing through the high-ceilinged rooms of the elegant home. Frank had nearly given up, convinced he'd made a terrible mistake, but Eleanor persisted with the quiet stubbornness that had carried her through decades of hardship. "Children like Tommy need consistency more than anything else," she explained to Frank one evening as they sat in his study, the crackling fireplace casting dancing shadows across leather-bound books. "Every change is like learning a whole new world. We just need to give him time to adjust to me being part of his routine." Frank nodded, dark circles prominent beneath his eyes. Since losing his wife Caroline to cancer 18 months ago, he'd thrown himself into his work as a senior partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, leaving Tommy in the care of a rotating door of specialized nannies. None had lasted more than a few weeks. The doctors said his regression after Caroline died was normal, Frank said, staring into his untouched scotch. But they also said he would likely improve with time. Instead, he's withdrawn more each month. Stopped eating, stopped the few words he used to say. His knuckles whitened around the glass. I don't know how to reach him. Eleanor studied the broken man before her. At 42, Frank should have been in his prime, but grief had carved premature lines into his handsome face. You're trying to reach him the way you would reach any child, she said gently, but Tommy experiences everything differently. His senses, his emotions, they're all heightened. What feels normal to us might be overwhelming to him. Then how do I connect with my own son? Frank asked, voice cracking. By entering his world instead of trying to force him into yours. The breakthrough came on a snowy Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Eleanor had started. She'd brought homemade applesauce, made from her mother's recipe, apples slow-cooked with a cinnamon stick and just a touch of honey. Tommy had been having a difficult day, refusing to leave his bedroom, distressed by the howling wind outside his window. Eleanor set up a small table in his room, arranging his stuffed rabbit carefully at one place and spooning applesauce into 2 bowls. My mother used to say that good food is like a warm hug from the inside out, she narrated as she worked, not expecting a response. This applesauce was my daughter Margaret's favorite when she was about your age. She'd had a rough bout of tonsillitis, couldn't swallow anything without pain. But this... Eleanor dipped a small spoon into the amber mixture. This slipped down easy as a summer breeze. To her astonishment, Tommy approached the table, watching her intently. He stood there silently for several moments before climbing into the chair opposite his rabbit. Eleanor continued her story, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. As she placed a bowl and spoon before him, she took a bite from her own bowl, exaggerating her enjoyment with a soft, mmm. Tommy picked up his spoon and dipped it into the applesauce. The first taste was tentative, but the second was more confident. By the third, he was eating steadily, focused entirely on the bowl before him. When Frank returned home that evening, Eleanor met him in the foyer, her eyes bright. He ate an entire bowl of applesauce, she announced without preamble, and then asked for more. Frank froze in the act of unwinding his scarf. He spoke. Not with words, Eleanor clarified, but he pushed his bowl toward me and made this little humming sound. Clear as day, he was asking for seconds. Frank's briefcase thudded to the floor. I need to see him. Slowly, Eleanor cautioned. He's had a good day, but too much excitement might overwhelm him. They found Tommy in his sensory room, a space filled with soft textures, gentle lights, and calming colors. He was sitting on a beanbag chair, methodically lining up colored blocks in a pattern only he understood. Frank knelt nearby, not too close, and simply watched his son. After several minutes, Tommy picked up a blue block and, without looking up, extended it toward his father. Frank's hand trembled as he accepted the offering. "Thank you, Tommy," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. That night, after Tommy had fallen asleep, Frank approached Eleanor as she prepared to leave. "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you know what he needed?" Eleanor buttoned her worn coat, smiling softly. "I didn't do anything special, Mr. Edwards. I just gave him what every child needs: patience, respect, and a little bit of homemade comfort." "My wife used to make applesauce," Frank admitted quietly. "Every fall she'd spend a weekend canning enough to last through winter. Tommy would sit on the counter and watch her. It was one of the few times he seemed truly content." Eleanor nodded, understanding dawning. Then perhaps it wasn't just the food, but the memory it carried. She patted his arm gently. Sometimes the way to a troubled mind is through the heart. As winter gave way to spring, Tommy's progress continued, albeit in small, incremental steps. He began to make eye contact, occasionally reached for Eleanor's hand when they walked in the nearby park, and developed a rudimentary form of communication through picture cards Eleanor had created. Frank, inspired by Eleanor's approach, started. Coming home earlier, spending evenings on the floor of Tommy's room, simply being present in his son's space. What would anyone driving past the Edwards brownstone make of this unlikely scene? A silver-haired woman in a hand-knit cardigan, a distinguished lawyer with his tie loosened, both sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a solemn-faced boy, celebrating the monumental achievement of a two-piece puzzle completed independently. Who could understand the magnitude of such a seemingly ordinary moment? But as Frank caught Eleanor's eye over Tommy's bent head, the shared recognition of a miracle passed between them. Could this fragile peace last? Would Tommy continue to emerge from his cocoon of isolation? And what would happen to the tenuous connection forming between this broken family and the elderly woman who had become their unlikely anchor? The Edwards housekeeper, Mrs. Perkins, watched the developing situation with narrowed eyes and pursed lips. After decades managing wealthy households, she recognized the potential complications of blurred boundaries. One morning, as Eleanor prepared Tommy's favorite oatmeal with mashed bananas, the housekeeper cornered her in the kitchen. "You're getting too attached," Mrs. Perkins warned, her voice pitched low. "Mr. Edwards is a prominent man in this city. People will talk if he becomes too—" She paused meaningfully, "dependent on someone like you." Eleanor continued stirring the oatmeal calmly. "Someone like me." "A soup kitchen volunteer," Mrs. Perkins clarified, though her tone suggested more. "This arrangement was meant to be temporary, to help the boy until a proper, qualified caregiver could be found. Mr. Edwards has received recommendations for several excellent specialized facilities where Tommy would receive professional care." The wooden spoon stilled in Eleanor's hand. "Facilities?" Mrs. Perkins nodded, satisfaction gleaming in her eyes at having landed her blow. "It's been discussed. The demands of raising a child like Tommy alone with Mr. Edwards' position, and responsibilities, sacrifices must sometimes be made for the greater good." Eleanor's heart constricted at the thought of Tommy in an institution, his progress halted, his tentative steps toward connection severed. But was it her place to interfere? She was, as Mrs. Perkins had pointedly noted, just a soup kitchen volunteer who had stumbled into their lives. That evening, as Tommy drifted to sleep while Eleanor read from his favorite picture book, Frank appeared in the doorway. He looked haggard, his tie askew, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. Eleanor tucked a blanket around Tommy's small form before following Frank into the hallway. "We need to talk," he said, leading her to his study. "There's been a development." What revelation awaited her? Had Frank decided to send Tommy away? Had he determined that Eleanor's simple approaches weren't enough for his son's complex needs? As she settled into the leather armchair across from his desk, Eleanor steeled herself for the end of this unexpected chapter in her life. For months, Eleanor had navigated the complex world of Tommy's mind with nothing but intuition and patience. As her guides, Frank watched in awe as she decoded his son's non-verbal cues, anticipated his triggers, and celebrated his smallest achievements with genuine joy. The first time Tommy initiated a hug, arms tentatively wrapping around Eleanor's neck as she read him a story, Frank had to excuse himself, overcome with emotion he couldn't express. "My colleagues think I should send Tommy to Lakeside," Frank said abruptly, naming an exclusive residential facility for children with severe developmental challenges. "They say it would give him the structure and specialized care he needs, while allowing me to focus on my career. He rubbed his forehead, conflict evident in every line of his body. The senior partnership I've worked toward for 15 years is within reach, but it would mean even longer hours, more travel. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap, but she remained silent, allowing Frank to continue. Mrs. Perkins agrees, he added. She thinks our current arrangement is unconventional. And what do you think, Mr. Edwards? Eleanor asked quietly. Frank stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the garden where spring bulbs were beginning to emerge. From the thawing earth, I think my son has smiled more in the past 3 months than in the year before you came into our lives, he said finally. I think my wife would have adored you and your applesauce. He turned, his expression vulnerable in a way Eleanor had never seen. And I think I'm terrified of making the wrong decision. Eleanor rose, her arthritis protesting after a long day. If I may speak plainly, Mr. Edwards, please call me Frank, he interrupted. After all this time, she nodded. Frank, then. I believe Tommy needs stability, consistency, and love more than any program or facility can provide. He's beginning to trust again, to engage with the world around him. A drastic change now could undo all his progress. But what about when you're no longer able to care for him? Frank asked, voicing the unspoken concern that hung between them. At 73, Eleanor's health was remarkably good, but time was an undefeated opponent. No one lives forever, Eleanor acknowledged, but we can prepare Tommy for transitions, build a network of support around him that doesn't depend solely on me. And in the meantime, she smiled gently, we can give him what every child deserves, a sense of belonging, of home. Frank studied her, this unassuming woman who had transformed their lives with nothing more extraordinary than kindness and homemade applesauce. I never thanked you properly, he said suddenly, for that day in the soup kitchen. If you hadn't noticed Tommy, if you hadn't approached him. Life puts us where we need to be sometimes, Eleanor replied simply. I needed Tommy as much as he needed me. Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet influence changed the trajectory of your life? Someone whose simple acts of kindness revealed possibilities you never imagined? If so, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Spring melted into summer, bringing with it new challenges and unexpected joys. Tommy celebrated his 7th birthday with a small gathering in the backyard. Just Frank, Eleanor, and Dr. Mendez, the gentle child psychologist who had recently joined Tommy's support team. It wasn't the kind of party most children would recognize. No crowds, no chaos, no overwhelming stimuli. But when Tommy actually blew out his candle, with considerable help, and reached for a piece of Eleanor's homemade strawberry cake, the adults exchanged glances of quiet triumph. He's made remarkable progress, Dr. Mendez observed later, as they watched Tommy methodically arranging his new wooden blocks by color and size. His non-verbal communication is expanding, his anxiety responses are decreasing, and he's demonstrating clear preferences and choices. Frank nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from his son. It's Eleanor, he said quietly. She's unlocked something in him that none of the specialists could reach. Dr. Mendez smiled. With all due respect to Mrs. Miller, I think it's the combination of her approach and your increased involvement, Mr. Edwards. Tommy senses the stability of having both of you fully present in his life. That security allows him to take risks, to reach out in ways he couldn't before. The psychologist's words lingered in Frank's mind long after she'd left. He found Eleanor in the kitchen, preparing mason jars for the cherry preserves she planned to make the following day. Without her knowledge, he'd arranged for her favorite sour cherries to be delivered from Michigan, a small token of appreciation that had brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Dr. Mendez thinks Tommy's progress is due to both of us, Frank said, leaning against the doorframe. The stability of having consistent care and attention. Eleanor nodded, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Children sense discord, even ones who process the world differently. Tommy knows he's safe now, that his world won't suddenly change without warning. Frank hesitated, then pressed forward. "I've made a decision about Lakeside," he said. "I'm not sending him, and I've turned down the senior partnership." Eleanor's eyes widened. "But your career—" "My career will survive," Frank interrupted, gently. "I've negotiated a more flexible arrangement. Less travel, more work from home. It means the partnership will be delayed, possibly indefinitely, but—" He shrugged. "Some things matter more." Eleanor studied the man before her, so different from the panicked, desperate father who had burst into the soup kitchen 6 months earlier. There was a peace about him now, a certainty that hadn't been there before. "Caroline would be proud of you," she said quietly. Frank's expression softened at the mention of his late wife. "She always saw what mattered most, even when I was blinded by ambition." He moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where Tommy was now arranging pine cones in a careful line. "I keep thinking about what you said that first day, about entering Tommy's world instead of forcing him into mine. I think I needed to learn that lesson even more than he did." As summer progressed, their unconventional family unit settled into comfortable rhythms. Eleanor maintained her small apartment, but spent most nights in the guest room at the Edwards home, her presence a constant that Tommy had come to expect and rely upon. She introduced Frank to the simple pleasures that had always sustained her: the satisfaction of homemade bread, the tranquility of early morning garden work, the joy of reading aloud even to a child who rarely responded. Frank, in turn, ensured that Eleanor received the medical care her pride had often led her to neglect. A new rheumatologist prescribed treatments that eased her arthritis. Updated glasses improved her vision. Dental work she'd postponed for years was finally completed. When he presented her with a lightweight electric mixer to replace her ancient, hand-cranked model, her protests died at the tender consideration behind the gift. Mrs. Perkins observed these developments with increasing disapproval, her comments growing more pointed by the week. "I suppose you'll be redecorating the house next," she sniffed after Eleanor suggested rearranging the kitchen for better efficiency. "Perhaps Mr. Edwards should just make you the lady of the house and be done with it." "Mrs. Perkins," Frank's sharp voice cut through the kitchen as he entered unexpectedly. "That's quite enough." The housekeeper flushed but held her ground. "Someone needs to consider appearances, sir. People are beginning to talk." "Let them," Frank replied coldly. "My only concern is my son's well-being." But despite his dismissive words, the exchange left a shadow. That night, after Tommy was asleep, Eleanor found Frank in his study, staring at a photograph of Caroline, beautiful, vibrant, gone too soon. "Mrs. Perkins isn't entirely wrong," Eleanor said quietly. "People will talk. A widower, a son with special needs, an elderly woman moving into their home. It creates a narrative, whether true or not." Frank set down the photograph. "Do you care what people say?" "No," Eleanor replied honestly. "At my age, gossip is the least of my concerns. But you have a position in this community, a reputation, and someday Tommy will be old enough to understand what people whisper." "What are you suggesting?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "Perhaps it's time I step back a bit. Help you find someone younger with proper qualifications who can be a long-term solution for Tommy's care." Frank's expression hardened. "Is that what you want?" "What I want isn't relevant," Eleanor said gently. "This was always meant to be temporary. I've grown to love Tommy dearly, but I'm 73 years old. He needs stability that extends beyond what I can realistically promise." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Frank stood. "Tommy has therapy tomorrow afternoon. After we drop him off, I'd like to show you something, if you're willing." Curious and somewhat apprehensive, Eleanor agreed. The following day, after leaving Tommy with Dr. Mendez for his regular session, Frank drove them not to the Edwards home, but to a modern building in the downtown area. The lobby directory listed various businesses and organizations, including Edwards Family Foundation, on the 10th floor. "What is this?" Eleanor asked as Frank guided her into the elevator. "Something I've been working on for the past 2 months," he replied cryptically. The elevator opened onto a space still under construction, workers installing drywall, electricians running wiring, the smell of fresh paint permeating the air. Frank led Eleanor through the partially finished area, pointing out different sections. "This will be a resource center for families of children with autism and developmental delays," he explained. "Specialized equipment, parent training areas, a lending library of adaptive tools, too expensive for most families to purchase outright." He gestured to another section. "And here, a community kitchen, where parents can learn to prepare foods that accommodate sensory issues and dietary restrictions." Eleanor turned to him, bewildered. "This is wonderful, but it's inspired by you," Frank said simply. "By what you've done for Tommy with nothing more than patience, creativity, and homemade applesauce." He hesitated, then continued more softly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said regarding long-term stability for Tommy, about preparing him for transitions, building a network that doesn't depend solely on one person." He guided her to a set of architectural plans laid out on a makeshift table. "The foundation will provide grants for in-home support, train caregivers in adaptive techniques, and create community for families who often feel isolated. We're partnering with Northwestern's Developmental Psychology Department for research components." Eleanor studied the plans, emotion welling in her throat. "Frank, this is remarkable. I'd like you to help me design the training program," he said, watching her closely. "To teach others your approach, the patience, the respect, the entering of a child's world rather than forcing them into ours. No one else has reached Tommy the way you have. Imagine how many other children could benefit from what you've learned." Eleanor felt overwhelmed, tears threatening. "I'm just an old woman who made some applesauce," she protested weakly. Frank shook his head. "You're the woman who showed me how to be a father to my son when I was ready to give up. You're the one who saw Tommy, really saw him, when everyone else only saw his diagnosis." He took her weathered hands in his. "I'm not asking you to step back, Eleanor. I'm asking you to step forward to help create something lasting." Emotion closed Eleanor's throat as she surveyed the space, the physical manifestation of hope rising from grief, of purpose emerging from chance connection. "Caroline would have loved this," she managed finally. "Yes," Frank agreed, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "She would have." After a moment he added, "There's one more thing." He led her to a smaller room near the back of the space. A cozy area with a window overlooking a small courtyard where workers were installing what appeared to be a sensory garden. Inside, partially assembled furniture suggested a comfortable office. "This," Frank said quietly, "would be yours. If you wanted it, a place to oversee the programs, to mentor new caregivers, to be the heart of what we're building here." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "Mine," Frank nodded. "You said you were concerned about providing long-term stability for Tommy. This way, you could gradually transition some of his daily care to others trained in your methods, while remaining central in his life. And you could help countless other families in the process." For a moment, Eleanor couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Frank was proposing. "You would trust me with this?" she finally asked. "A soup kitchen volunteer with no formal education?" Frank smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since that fateful day in the kitchen. "I would trust you with everything that matters," he said simply. What awaits for Eleanor, Frank, and Tommy is a question that only the coming days can answer. Will this unlikely partnership flourish into something transformative? Could a chance encounter over a bowl of soup truly change not just one life, but potentially hundreds? In the warmth of a Chicago summer evening, as fireflies dance in the garden and the scent of Eleanor's cherry preserves fills the kitchen, 3 damaged souls continue their hesitant journey toward healing. The path ahead remains uncertain, but for the first time in too long, it shimmers with possibility. "I've been thinking," Frank said one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching Tommy arrange his collection of smooth stones in the fading light. "About what to call the main program at the foundation," Eleanor hummed questioningly, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. "Grandma's touch," Frank suggested, glancing at her reaction. "Because that's what you've given Tommy, the unconditional love and acceptance that every child deserves, the kind that traditionally came from grandmothers who had the wisdom to see beyond behavior to the heart of a child's needs." Eleanor's hands stilled. "Oh, Frank, too sentimental?" he asked with a small smile. "No," she replied softly. "Perfect." As twilight deepened into night, as Tommy curled trustingly against Eleanor's side for his bedtime story, as Frank watched them with eyes that had finally found peace, the foundations of their unexpected family strengthened. From the ashes of grief and loneliness, from a chance encounter over a bowl of soup on a cold Chicago afternoon, something beautiful was emerging. Proof that sometimes the most profound healing comes from the simplest human connections. In the end, isn't that what we're all searching for? Not grand gestures or dramatic solutions, but the quiet miracle of being truly seen and accepted exactly as we are. Eleanor had offered that gift to a lost little boy and his grieving father. Now together, they would extend it to countless others. The future remained unwritten, but whatever challenges it held, they would face them as they had faced everything else since that fateful day in the soup kitchen. With patience, with courage, and with the transformative power of simple human kindness. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments, so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.